People who spend lots of time in remote areas, what is the scariest thing you have seen? I grew up and still live in a really tiny town. My bedroom's only window faces out to the street, the room's on bottom level, and until I was around 15, there were no blinds on the window. On 2 different occasions, I was sitting on my bed only to look up and see a face staring inside from my window. The person sprinted away quickly both times. On another occasion, I woke up in the middle of the night, looked out the window, and saw a face again. Except this time, instead of just running away, the person gave me the finger and then ran away. Going to help some hikers in the fog and realized they were maybe 5 feet from going straight over the edge. We were up on the Pennines. Fog rolls in very quickly, and if you're used to that, it's not a big deal. You just stay put and wait for it to pass. So me and my mates are sat with a thermos and bacon sarnies. It's all good. Then we hear these 2 voices going, "Hello? Help?" moving towards us. We yell back to them to wait, and after a bit of back and forth, they do. We've got hiking sticks and that, so we make our nice and slow way over. Get there, and these 2 are maybe 20 with a very nice map and no compass and no idea where they are. So we sit with them, pour the coffee, and wait for the fog to lift. Then it starts thinning out, and we look around. We're on a nice semi-flat patch, there's a few rocks, and a few steps away is the nice sheer edge of a good-sized drop-off. I used to live in the middle of nowhere, a mile down a dusty dirt road through the woods with only a handful of mobile homes scattered through the pines, made sure no one was close enough to help you if crap went down. My neighbors were my grandparents. My grandmother fed stray cats, so it was perfectly normal for a random cat to be sulking around. One night I come home well after midnight and a random black cat is sitting on my porch. Whatever, it's catching bugs and the only light around this late at night. As I got out my car and got to the porch, crap got real. This cat turns its head to look at me, stands up on its hind legs, eyes lock with mine, turns around, runs away from me. It's on its hind legs, pumping its arms as it runs, jumps off the porch, lands on its hind legs, keeps running like a person off into the darkness. I'm sorry, but I know that would be scary to see in person, but the visual in my mind is not scary. It's very silly. I grew up in a small town. At the time, there might have lived 800 to 1,000 people there, close to the Alps. One night, me and a friend of mine wanted to drive to a friend's house with our bikes who lived outside of the town. So while we were driving in the pitch black night with no lights anywhere close, we heard a huge, enormous bang. At the same time, it went from pitch black to daylight bright for a split second. I looked up in the sky and saw a massive burning ball-shaped thing flying overhead of us in the speed of light. If you blinked, you missed it. We both were scared crapless and thought a UFO crashed close to us. You have to imagine this happened all in like 1.5 seconds out of nowhere. The next day, my friend wrote the government. We were young, like 12 years old, asking for answers about that UFO. Strangely enough, he got a response from the Office of Air Traffic Control, or however you want to call that, and they wrote something like, "Congratulations, what you've seen was a small comet entering the Earth's atmosphere. The chances of seeing that is like you getting hit by lightning or winning the lottery." Crap was insane, scary, but absolutely awesome at the same time. I used to live in the middle of nowhere. We had one neighbor whose house we couldn't even see through the trees and hills. On the other side of us, up another hill, there was a dirt road that basically went nowhere. At the beginning of the dirt road, there was this old abandoned church which made it automatically creepy. Anyway, berries used to grow down this dirt road, so we'd go pick them. On the way back one day, we got an extremely strong scent of cologne. A quick scan didn't show anyone, but every time the wind blew, we got another whiff. Still don't know where the scent was coming from, but it creeped me out big time. You don't think about how no one could hear you scream until you're forced to. I live in the woods in the middle of nowhere. Creepy stuff happens all the time. When we first moved in here, I kept thinking I'd hear someone walking in the woods while I was alone. It's a flood zone, so the house is on stilts and you can hear footsteps when anyone walks across the floor. Of course, this is Texas, so I just grab my handgun and go and see if someone had come in. Also, my mother-in-law has a key, and when she drops in and leaves things for the family, she sometimes won't re-lock the door. I kept feeling like I was going to walk into a room and someone would be there, just feeling oddly watched all day for a few days. My husband didn't think anything of it, and one night he jumped out of bed, grabbed his handgun, and started going through the house, slamming all the doors wide open. He said he heard banging in the kitchen like someone was going through the pantry. He was adamant he had heard someone. Nothing. Doors still locked. My niece got home from her grandmother's house and a few nights later asked if she could sleep on a cot in our room. She's a teenager, not a small kid, so I asked her what was wrong. She didn't want to tell us because we wouldn't believe her, just that she didn't want to be alone. She said she heard banging in the kitchen, and when she heard that or felt like someone was in the house, she would see a man in the window of her room, so she basically noped out and came to us. We let her stay, and the next day we were all a little uneasy. My husband, a notorious non-believer in the paranormal, came in looking shaken and said he had closed her door after bringing her laundry into the room, and a man had been smiling at him in the window. The windows on the house are almost 20 feet in the air because of the stilts the house sits on. That's a big old yikes for me. That's just a lot of creepy coincidences, and frankly, even for a skeptic like me, I'd be pretty on edge. I used to have an old cemetery in the woods near my house, had graves in it from the 1840s all the way to 1960s. During the winter, when all the leaves had fallen, you could see the clearing from our living room. Every now and then, I would walk past the window and catch sight of a guy in a dark black suit just sitting on one of the tombstones. But when I turned, it was nothing. It used to drive me frickin' insane. I was never really scared of it, just annoyed that it always happened. Eventually, I got so sick of it that my cousin and I went out and cleaned up the cemetery, raked all the leaves, pulled out the vines, chopped down a few trees that were growing too close, and even scrubbed down the headstones. Then loudly announced after we were done, "Look, we cleaned this place up for y'all. Please stop trying to F with us. If you want to sit around, go ahead, but don't just disappear when we look your way. It's really annoying." Never happened to me again, though it did happen to friends when they came over, and my baby brother claims to have gone out and talked to the guy in the suit. Said his name was William. I spent a year living in northern Cali in an extremely remote area. Closest neighbor was 20 minutes further up the mountain. Tons of bears, lynx, and mountain lions. We always carried guns if we were going from one part of our property to another. Too many times the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I knew I was being tracked by something. All we could do was fire a couple of rounds into the woods and hope it scared whatever it was away. This was probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I was about 16 years old. I lived with my dad on a small farm in southern Oregon. There are about 2 to 3 neighbors spread out around 5 or so mile radius. Everywhere else is just woods. Just these gnarly oak trees and dirt roads leading off to different hunting stands or places for teenagers to go and drink without interruption. My dad plays keyboard in a band, and as long as I can remember, he would take off the occasional Friday or Saturday night to play in one of the local bars, coming back around 2 or 3 in the morning. Anyways, one of these nights that he was away, me and my brother were playing some Xbox in the front room when I heard the home phone ring. We had a landline back then. I went to pick it up, and it happened to be our closest neighbor. His name was Kurt, and he operated a full-on dairy farm, unlike our small homesteader-esque farm of a few goats and a couple geese and chickens. So I asked him what was up, and he only really called, and never so late in the night, to tell us about some emergency or situation. Kurt told me, as my blood literally seemed to turn to ice, that someone had been slamming against his barn door. He told me that him and the missus had been watching TV when they noticed between commercial breaks that there was a crashing, splintering sound coming from outside toward the barn where the horses stables. Apparently, Kurt went outside and found a huge hole in the door to the barn and went in to investigate. I don't really know what he saw inside, but I swear to God, I will remember what he said to me for the rest of my life. Kurt told me that something had broken into his barn and that there was a smell like nothing he had ever smelled before. The thing he told me before telling me he was headed to our farm was that he saw the something loping towards our house. He told me to hang up, to go and take my younger brother and hide. I hung up and just stood there. To be completely honest, I was high as crap. Both me and my brother had been smoking a lot that night, and so I was fairly stunned by what I heard. I went back to the living room where my brother was and sat down fairly perplexed. This part of the story is where it might seem like fiction, but I swear to God, this happened. I started hearing my goats bleating outside the way they do when I get home from work or when somebody approaches. They started bleating, then they started screaming. If you've never heard an animal scream for help, then I envy you. At first, my brother and I just sat there wide-eyed, listening in disbelief and horror, trying to just comprehend what was going on. Then both of us just kind of stood up and started towards the door. I was high and scared, and I definitely still remembered my conversation with Kurt not 15 minutes ago. And while I'm certainly not a bad butt by any means, there is no way any compassionate person can listen to a goat or something being murdered and screaming without doing something. That's just what was happening. When we opened the door to the outside, we smelled/heard it already. The sound was utterly horrifying. A pure, unrelenting scream from one of our dear goats combined with a horrible smell. I can only describe the smell as something like iron. I think that was the goat blood, with a moldy, wet fur, sort of pungent foot kind of smell. I looked from the doorstep. Our goat pen is literally steps away from the door. We love our goats. And saw the horribly mutilated bodies of a few of our goats. Something big was hunched over the carcasses. A couple of the goats were sitting in the corner bleeding helplessly. My brother slammed the door shut and started sobbing. I sat down on the floor, and I'm not ashamed to say I was crying. I'm going to wrap this up quickly because I hate talking about this, let alone writing about this, but essentially after a few minutes, Kurt showed up, and a few gunshots later, he came inside to tell us that everything was okay again. He never told us what he saw, but he told my dad. The next day, my dad went out and bought a rifle. If this doesn't sound like the rising action of a truly terrifying horror movie, I don't know what is. I'm not saying it didn't actually happen, I have no idea, but I do know that it sounds absolutely terrifying. I live in Billings, Montana. I was in high school about 15 years ago, and as an adolescent with my first car, just driving around at night was a fun activity for us kids during the summer. For a couple of years, we would see this delivery truck driving around residential neighborhoods. It had a cow print on the side and MDS printed over that, so we figured milk delivery service. These guys weren't out at 4 a.m. though, so we made this joke saying it must be a drug delivery service. So my friends and I tried to follow them a few times. They would routinely turn off their headlights while driving in these residential areas, and if we would try to follow the truck, would act sketchy and take weird turns like they were trying to shake us. We got freaked out one night when the truck turned a corner and we went down a block and circled around. The truck had pulled over, and right when we went past the street, the headlights came on and suddenly the guy floored it. We busted butt back home and stopped that little excursion of trying to chase this guy. The next time I saw one of the delivery trucks was on a main road in the part of town we called the Heights. So his headlights were on, I was driving in the opposite lane so he would pass on my left. I swear to anything you consider holy, that last time I saw that truck, I did not see a driver. It looked like that truck was driving itself. I still wonder what was up with that weird MDS delivery truck. I saw 3 of them abandoned together in an old junkyard about 5 years later. Still gave me the heebie-jeebies. I live in a pretty rural area in southwest Nebraska, middle of nowhere, blah blah snore. Okay, so my boyfriend and I were in a heated fight and decided to take it outside so we wouldn't disturb anyone else in the house. So we go outside, past the tree claim at about 11 p.m., total darkness, just empty cornfields every which direction. We commenced screaming at each other, and then seemingly out of the sky we heard the loudest stampede. A herd of horses, charging cattle, demons. We ripped around to try and see into the blackness where the F the noise was coming from, but there was nothing. Just this barreling, monstrous, unmistakable effing stampede noise and us in the massive darkness. We hauled butt back inside and to this day cannot explain what the F that was. Note, we were nowhere near any train tracks by at least 15 miles. Probably a bunch of animals trying to run away from the uncomfortable sound of you two fighting and yelling at each other. That's what I would be doing. Content warning. S-assault/R. I don't live in a rural area. I live in a small town on the south coast of England, and it's true we don't have many scary urban myths or whatnot, but crime is a problem anywhere. When I was in final year of school, so at 16, we used to party in a woodland military training area on the beach side of the town. We used to build a big fire, take an amp, and listen to loud music with drugs and alcohol. It was a nice spot, quite secluded, and off the dog trails, so besides my group of friends, only a few people would know about it. Anyway, at about 11 p.m. on a Saturday, me and a couple friends were arriving to this get-together a little late, and as we were walking down the main dog walking trail, we passed two men and a woman. One of the men had his arm locked in hers, and the other had a hand on her shoulder. We didn't think anything of it. The two men were laughing, and we assumed they were drunk and doing the same thing we were elsewhere in the woodland park. At one point in the night, we heard a fox's mating call. You know the one, a gutless scream? Yeah, you can probably see where this is going. So the party goes on well into the night, and several of us didn't end up leaving until the sun was coming up. We were already hungover, and by the following Monday morning in the local news, we had heard that two Irishmen had been arrested following the R of a 17-year-old girl. In the same place we were partying, only somewhere else in the woodland. She had gone to the police on the Sunday. It turns out they were her brother's friends. It was in the paper, but I didn't know what her name was. I don't think they were allowed to release that information to the public. Now, the horrible thing is, we saw them. I am 100% certain the two men and the girl we saw were those involved in the crime. I'm a little less certain of this, but the fox scream could very well have been her calling out for help. It wasn't scary in the slightest at the time, but thinking back on it still makes me sick to my effing stomach. Even makes me feel guilty about being obnoxious teenagers and ignoring the outside world to consume as much vodka as possible. Our music no doubt overwhelmed any other noise from that park that night. Horrible story, but no doubt they're still serving jail time. At least they should be. I live in the country, and I spent almost all of last year getting harassed in the middle of the night. I had this habit at the time of going on late-night walks throughout the neighborhood/forest, and my family theorizes that I either got too close to where my now-deceased neighbor was growing weed, or that someone saw me out and decided to take interest in me. The first thing that happened was that I started getting creepy feelings while out walking, like I was being watched from this one point just beyond the edge of the forest next to my house. I thought I was just letting my imagination get the better of me until I found a condom in the exact spot I was getting the weird vibes from. After that, I would hear knocking on the wall that is actually past the tree line, tapping on the windows, and people talking. I did convince my mother to go check it out a few times, but whoever it was would already be running back through the forest by the time she got outside. Things got so bad that my uncle put up a security camera, but it was displaying a live feed as opposed to actually recording. He also insisted on monitoring from his house for some reason and never actually saw anyone on camera. Around this time, someone cut open the cover that was on my grill and stole a storage crate full of my clothing. Once the batteries in the camera died, my uncle decided that it was obviously just my imagination and took the camera down. Not even a week later, I was walking to my grandparents' house, which is about 100 feet away. Around 11 p.m., I had forgotten to lock their door when I saw a person in light-colored clothing duck behind their porch. I rushed back down to my house, and my mother offered to go instead of me. She had to chase the man off the property. She didn't see his face or anything, but on the bright side, he ran into a tree. The man was on my property in mid-November of last year, and my neighbor who grew weed in the forest somewhere died in December. Things more or less stopped since then, supporting my family's belief that it was just him and his associates playing some kind of sick joke. The only problem with that theory is that I heard a ringtone sound right outside my bedroom window earlier this year. Unfortunately, this isn't the scariest thing to happen to me involving a late-night creep, just the scariest thing to happen in the middle of nowhere. This is the kind of stuff that is actually terrifying. Ghost sightings and strange animals are one thing, but this kind of stuff is real. Real in a way that is absolutely horrifying and something a lot of people have to deal with, and I am so sorry for what you had to go through, OP. Same with what happened in that previous story. Stay safe out there, everyone. This is a true creepy story about a random town. This was back when I was in middle school, so 9 years ago. I grew up in a town that was pretty suburban, but in a county that was pretty huge because a lot of it was just forest and mountain ranges, but only 30 miles from my state's capital city. My older brother was tasked with driving me to a friend's house one night that was way out in the windy forest roads of the county that he had driven me to a couple times before. So we're almost there, and we drive by this dirt road with a fence that I had never seen open before, but was that night. And on the map, it looked like it was a through street that would lead us right to where we wanted to go and would probably save us some time. There were no private road signs or keep out signs or anything, so we turned down it. After a minute or so, we see a couple small buildings and houses, almost like an old western town, all on this one road, but we don't make it too far down because two guys, one probably 20 years old and the other a teenager standing outside, come up to our car and tap on the window. My brother rolls it down and the older one says, "Hey, are you lost?" And my brother says something like, "No, I'm just trying to get to a friend's house through this road." It was at this time that I noticed the younger one has a creepy stare and holds the same creepy half-smile look on his face the whole interaction, and I started to get really uncomfortable and scared at this point. And the taller one says, "You gotta turn around and go back the way you came." My brother says, "Well, that gate was open and on my map it looks like a through street." The older guy says, "Look, dude, I'm trying to help you. You have to turn back now the way you came. Please, don't come back." So my brother looks at me and probably notices how scared I looked, so he just says, "Okay, thanks," rolls up his window, turns right around and drives back out of that creepy gate. It gets more creepy because the next day we went back on Google Maps to try and see if this road had a name or anything, and next to the road it just says Smiley Town. No street or road or drive or court, just Smiley Town. Which was even weirder because I knew that area was all a part of the same town my friend lived in. I can remember that whole thing so vividly, and last year we were reminiscing about it for the first time since that day with our significant others, who didn't believe us, so we brought up a map on a phone to show, and there was nothing that said Smiley Town anymore. But when we switched to Street View, all we could see was a barely visible overgrown gate that looked like it hadn't been open in years. I probably thought it was more creepy than it actually was since I was 12 at the time, but still, a good story. I live out in the country. There are maybe 5 houses on my long dirt road. Last week, my neighbor asked if he could come over and talk to us about something. He didn't knock, just walked right in and had a loaded gun with him. He started talking a mile a minute about a war coming to our road, knowing people who are 300 years old, vampires walking out of the woods, being able to see the Matrix code. He had a hospital bracelet on his wrist. Turns out he decided to go off his medication and was in a manic depressive state. The scariest part was waiting for my husband to return from taking the guy back home. The creepiest part of it was when I called his girlfriend to let her know what was going on. She knew he had gone off his meds and thought she could cure him with love. She talked like it was completely normal and didn't seem to be taking it seriously. I reported the incident to the cops, but he ended getting arrested later on, an unrelated matter. I feel for the guy. He's back on his meds and getting help now, thankfully, but I lock my doors while I'm at home during the day now. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.